And welcome to our part 2 of our lecture on early European dress. And here we're going to conclude on women's wear and talk about menswear. And a main garment for women was what was later to be called a gown, the houppelande. Now the houppelande is what again will eventually be called a gown, and it's very fitted on the shoulder, and then it would be looser below that, and it would be belted at the waist. Now the lengths did vary, but the longest was reserved for special occasions. Sleeves are very wide and they would reach the ground. Very high upright collar, sometimes reaching the ears, and jagged edges. Now in these two pictures you can see one is a costume and it's lined in velvet, and the one on the left has actual fur trim. Some of them did have fur trim. You could see the belt was very wide, very fitted on the shoulders, and then it starts widening out with on the borders of the sleeve, the bottom skirt hem, and around the neck. And as you can see on the picture to the right, the collar portion, the neckline portion is starting to lift up, and some of them got very stiff and they would actually reach almost your ears. So one thing that you do have to understand for women's wear is that it's less extravagant, less fancy, less ornamental than men's. Men's wear actually has more design to it than women's wear. Now there's going to be a point in time in the future lecture that I'll tell you this is a point where that switches and women's wear is more elaborate. But at this point, it's menswear that has more design details to it than women's, because most people think it's the opposite, and that's not the case here. Now the main item was the kirtle or gown, and it became very tight body, very fitted at the waist, and then a full skirt flaring out. Very super tight, very fitted sleeves that had to be buttoned up. Again, you can't just slip it in over your head and then slip your arms in, because it was very fitted, very tight, so it needed those row of buttons. And also long streamers or tippets at the sleeves that would trail to the ground when your arms were down. This shows several pictures of items that women would wear. As you can see, the sleeves on the gown, if you can see, very long, that if you put your arms down, it would reach the ground. So you can see similar sleeves. You can see also a chemise, which we'll be talking about, which is the white underdress. And you can see the belt, the cincher, which is knotted belt, and a cape. You could see sometimes the cape. And these are great pictures. You can see the buttons on the girl that's furthest to the left. You can see the row of buttons. So that would be opened up. You slip your arm through it, and then it would be buttoned up. And as you can start seeing, we're starting to see these underlayers. You can see like patterns underneath that outer layer. So the kirtle under the girdle is underneath. Over the gown was the cote hardie. The cote hardie was similar to the men's. Sleeves had long streamers or tippets, and it did trail to the ground. And in about middle of the 14th century, it became very fashionable to wear the sideless surcoat. So you need to know this one as well. So the sideless surcoat has openings on either side, and it shows your inner gown showing through as contrast. The front formed a stiffened, what they call the stomacher, that they often would call the placard. And what it was is a very stiff, unbending front. So as you can see right here in this picture, so do you see this outer portion, this white portion with the skirt? See on the sides, it's open, and there's an underdress underneath. Okay, so this is the sideless surcoat. And see the very center, that would be called a placard. And this is the beginnings of what you would see as a stay, which it's known to you as a corset, but they used to call it a stay. We still don't have the corset yet, but this is the beginnings of that. What was innovative about the Middle Ages? It's the tight lacing, because they wanted really super tight fit on these dresses. Because remember, up until this point, we've had what? We've had the chiton, we've had the toga, the tunic, everything is loose. This is the first time we now have really fitted shapes. And what they really kind of exploited and really invented and innovated was with lacing. Before, the examples I gave you had very, long row of small buttons. And this time they decided to replace that or use it in combination with lacing. And that's where you get, again, the beginning of that corsetry. So tight lacing was exploited at this time. This, again, not the Byzantine, but this is where they started exposing their chest a little bit. So they would start, the neckline started dropping and dropping, And because the dress was so tight, it would push everything up. So they started cutting away the top of the robe to kind of reveal their chest. In doing so, the veil kind of disappeared, and that basically, not disappeared, I shouldn't say that, but basically it was reserved just for nuns or widows. That's who would wear the veils. And headdresses started becoming very elaborate. Still, menswear was still considered more elaborate, but women's wear hats, lots of plumes, which is feathers. Hats became more elaborate, and as you can see in some of these, very tight, and you can see that top of the gown is being cut off. So some still would be more modest about it, but you can start seeing more and more top of the gowns cut off, and you see more cleavage showing. And that's where you see that exposure and tie lacing. And you would see the tie lacing on the sleeves as well as the front bodice. Now, by the end of the 13th century, a couple of more innovative things for women. For headwear, crespine, or the crespin, which basically made its appearance, and often worn with the barbette. Remember, that's head covering, and the wimple, which is the chin strap, and the fillet, which is that strip. And this is new, because what you have to understand is, before this, exposing your hair was considered immoral. That started changing. And the crespine then became something that you would wear by itself. And then the veil kind of came back. So remember, they had the veil, it disappeared, only nuns and widows would wear it. Now it came back. And now these really elaborate headpieces in combination with veils became really popular and fashionable. So the goffer veil, or the nebula headdress, which is basically a half circle of linen framing your face, and sometimes they would have multiple layers, not just one. And the fillet had basically a new shape, which basically had two hollow ornamental pillars where they would draw the hair, they would pull the hair through that. So it was very elaborate. So when you see this and you see those braided hair, that's actual hair being braided through. That's very elaborate. Okay, so the crespine, as you can see, the veil, and as you can see, looks very happy to have that on her head. And one thing that's really interesting, it can be very severe, but look at the row of pearls. Some of them had beautiful beading and stones attached to it. And this is the barbette with the wimple, so the chin strap and the crown and the head covering. One thing that you have to understand about the women's headdress, it just kept getting more and more elaborate. So there wasn't one particular shape, lots of varieties, lots of different shapes. The idea was elaborate, because their dresses weren't as elaborate. So more cushioning, horn headdresses, things had multiple layers of veil, high, more volume, more height. The hennin, or the steeple headdress, was more popular in France. In England, they had a truncated cone. There were some that were called a butterfly or flower pot headdress. So that gives you an idea, as you can see in this picture, just some really stiff shapes and adding height. So in this picture, the hennin, and that's the cone with the fabric going right from the end. That's a hennin. It's really popular at this time. So lots of different shapes and silhouettes for their headpieces. Now for the menswear, the second half of the 15th century had some changes. Main garment was the doublet, but it was worn very short and very tight and padded. And as I mentioned before, some people didn't like it. They said it was kind of obscene. To add to that, since they were so short and they had their breeches, which, remember, those that were high class had really tight breeches, they would use their codpiece. And what happened was that they wanted to really put their manhood on display, and the codpieces were a way of doing that. So they literally would have an extra ornamental part right there, right dead center, so people can actually look at their manhood. And that was a way of showing that you were attractive and that you were a manly man. High stand-up collar, the coat hardy, basically replaced the jacket, also called a jerkin, and it was getting tighter and tighter, more and more fitted with time. Padded shoulders, basically to widen the body and kind of show power, right? Give you wider, broader shoulders, full sleeve. Some of those sleeves were detachable. So as you can see in this picture, if you notice on some of these, you can see that overlap on the shoulder and the sleeve. That's because the sleeves were detachable. And you can see they got very, very tight and shorter. Some had almost like a peplum, and you can see their breeches. And some had really tight breeches, and other has, as you can see this, because the shape is going to start evolving and becoming like pumpkin or voluminous breeches. At this point, now that we've moved towards the second half, or towards the later half of the Middle Ages, the haute blonde is now called a gown, and it's no longer worn by women. It's worn by older men, doctors, and magistrates. It's basically long, fastened down in the front with hook and eye. Sometimes it was worn with or without belts and usually full sleeves. When it was hung low, the volume of the sleeves would pull down a little bit. And lining the gown with fur was common as well for men. So this is the men's version of the houppelande. So women stopped wearing it. Males, headgear, basically the liripipe, which you could see pictured here, it was universal. All males would have it. It's basically a hood with this long piece of fabric hanging from the side. The chaperon, which is a circular padded roll, had a georgette attached to it. And, around the 15th century, more males wore hats and different shapes. Some were flat, some were narrow, some were tall, they had height, others were flatter, others were more circular, some were wider. So a large variety. Just like the women had variety in hats, so did the men. So as you can see, this is a liripipe in the chaperon, and they look very thrilled to be wearing those. Probably because of the shape of the hat. I don't know. But as you can see in this picture, tons of different shapes. So there wasn't one typical shape. The liripipe was the most common though, for sure. The previous two were the most common, but still, you can see lots of different shapes, just like for women. So headgear became very popular. And the last thing, the shoes. So one thing that's very identifiable, if you start, when you're looking at pictures and they start blending together and they look the same, look at the shoes. One thing that's distinctive of this time period is they're pointed, exaggerated, and as you can see this picture, very exaggerated shoes. Now what's interesting here is there were sumptuary laws by King Edward III. It's not kind, sorry, I have to fix that. King Edward III. And basically, no one should wear shoes with spikes that exceeded 2 inches. Sumptuary law, just so you know, it's a law that is used to prohibit people from wearing something or amount of something. But the idea is to control and usually keep the separation of classes. And this didn't work. They started wearing these, what they call the cracko or the polane, which basically it's super long and pointed. I mean, that point is useless, right? Your toes aren't there. They stop about, way before that. But basically they ignored the sumptuary laws and they kept wearing those pointed shoes. So if you look at these, I love this painting. It's one of my favorites because you could look at their shoes and you think, oh, well, the painter clearly exaggerated how long the tips of these shoes were. Actually, the painter did not exaggerate. They were that long in defiance of the sumptuary laws. So even back then, people defied the law. Not new. Nothing new. Okay? Alrighty, so this concludes the Middle Ages. Thank you so much for listening.